He will be remembered for being the first person to ever escape from a high-security C-Max prison in Pretoria.
Mathe, a Mozambican national, was convicted of 64 charges including rape, attempted murder, robbery and theft.
November 2006, in South Africa's most secure prison, C-Max in Pretoria, something officials said could never happen is happening. Annanias Mathe, considered one of the country's most dangerous criminals, is under 24-hour lockdown and constant surveillance. He finally puts his plan into action. He removes his clothes one by one, covering his body in a slippery layer of Vaseline, making him slippery and nearly invisible in the dark. Within minutes, he squeezes his body through the tiny reinforced window of his cell, just 20 by 60 centimeters, and squeezes through. He ties the material of his clothes to a makeshift rope and lowers himself inch by inch down the 19-meter wall. Halfway there, he stops and scribbles a final, defiant message to his guards on the wall. 2 blasphemous words that say it all. Then, without a trace but a whisper of grease and a muffled curse, he slips into the night. For 3 weeks, Mathe disappears. While the nation is stunned, police posters appear in the air and the airwaves are filled with manhunt announcements. But on December 4, 2006, a security officer from a car tracking company spots Mathe in a hijacked vehicle in Johannesburg. A gunfight breaks out. Mathe is wounded and recaptured, ending the first and only successful escape from the C-Max. He returns to prison, but the legend of the C-Max Houdini is only just beginning. To understand this extraordinary escape, we must rewind to Annanias Mathe's beginning. He was born in rural Mozambique in the late 1970s, in a small village called Chikumban, near Zai. Mozambique was one of the poorest countries in the world, still reeling from decades of civil war. Many children grew up in despair and poverty, and Mathe's own childhood was reportedly troubled. In court, he later claimed he had been beaten as a boy and had fled home at age 12. Psychologists would describe him as having an antisocial personality, a man shaped by fear and cruelty rather than care. As a young man, Mathe drifted into crime. By January 2005, he had crossed into South Africa. That month, on a lonely stretch of highway, he and an accomplice hijacked a vehicle, and Mathe opened fire on a traffic officer who tried to stop them. The policeman was shot and wounded. Mathe was arrested and locked up in Johannesburg's Central Police high-risk cell. But even in this fortified jail, Mathe's influence and ambition did not wane. His criminal network, a militarized gang of roughly 40 men operating between Mozambique and South Africa, rallied to his side. In April 2005, Mathe's gang pulled off their first big rescue. 4 men from Chikumban brought R15,000 in cash to Johannesburg, a bribe for a corrupt jailer. The officer looked the other way, and Mathe walked free from the high-risk unit as if on an ordinary day. Once loose, he began a 9-month rampage across South Africa's provinces. Between 2005 and 2006, Mathe's gang descended on homes and towns like a shockwave. They struck in wealthy suburbs of Johannesburg, Parkview, Sandton, and in poor rural villages in Limpopo and Northwest provinces. Everywhere they went, they left fear behind. In the dark of night, they broke into homes. In one Parkview apartment, Mathe stood at the doorway and aimed his rifle. A middle-aged woman was startled in her house. When she answered the door, a bullet tore into her shoulder. She crumpled to the floor in terror. In the same raid, a man rushing out to help was met by gunfire, bleeding at Mathe's feet as his family screamed. Even household pets were not spared. Investigators later found that Mathe had been poisoning dogs to make attacks easier. He laced meat with pesticide, feeding it to guard dogs. Before each invasion, a dog would grow sick and die, silencing its alarms so the gang could sneak in. Inside the darkened homes, the gang robbed and often raped without mercy. Police and court records show at least 7 women were brutally assaulted during Mathe's spree. One victim's clothing was sliced away by Mathe himself in a chilling act of control. Most nights ended with a car disappearing down the road. The gang had learned to hijack vehicles and install trackers inside. These gadgets would eventually help the police catch Mathe, but during those months, the trackers were Mathe's advantage. He could slip away in a stolen car after a heist, confident he could ditch it before law enforcement arrived. This was organized crime at its worst. The gang operated like an army. They used radios to coordinate, planned precise routes, and even revisited neighborhoods on consecutive nights, as if to terrorize survivors twice over. One police officer noted in frustration, Mathe's group was militarized, far more disciplined and strategic than a random band of thieves. His base remained in Mozambique's shadows, where South African police had little reach. In late 2005, after months of such terror, something finally happened. The net was closing around him. In late 2005 or early 2006, Mathe's luck ran out, for the moment. South African law enforcement surrounded one of the gang's hideouts. There was a gunfight. Mathe was wounded and captured. The rampage was over. He was returned to Pretoria's C-Max maximum security prison, charged now with dozens of crimes: murder, rape, attempted murder, armed robbery, hijacking, housebreaking, and more. Police said the docket was massive, well over 50 counts in total. Mathe was placed in solitary confinement at C-Max under constant watch. Yet even here, far from civilization, he did not resign himself to captivity. As his lawyers prepared for trial, another plan was hatched. 18 November 2006. The world knows this date as the night Mathe pulled off the impossible. The prison was locked down. Guards patrolled dim corridors. In a tiny cell, just 6 square meters, Mathe executed his audacious escape. Inside the cell, Mathe had only a toothbrush, a plastic cup, and a spoon as belongings. Yet he somehow managed to smuggle in a hacksaw blade hidden in the handle of his toothbrush. Over time, he quietly chipped away at the mortar around the window, bit by bit loosening the reinforced steel frame. When the day came, he stuck with his daring plan, stripping naked and slathering himself in grease. The task was Herculean. He was still wearing heavy iron shackles on his ankles, and yet, inch by inch, he contorted his body through the slim window. He slid down the outside wall on ropes made of clothing, the night air whipping at him. As he reached the ground below, he left behind a scar in that gray wall, 2 words scrawled defiantly by his own hand. For a while, it looked like he had truly walked out the door. C-Max's officials were horrified. How had he done it? In a frenzy, a multi-agency manhunt began, deploying armed police dogs and helicopters. The corrections department was embarrassed. Some blamed it on slick body grease. Others whispered of bribes and inside help. A parliamentary committee eventually concluded that prison guards had been paid off, that the grease story alone didn't add up. Mathe's own wives in Mozambique even admitted they helped raise the R80,000 bribe to free him. But none of that mattered in the immediate moment. The shadowy figure who had vanished from the C-Max window was still out there, on the run. For nearly 3 weeks, Annanias Mathe eluded the net of police checkpoints and roadblocks across Gauteng and Limpopo. Authorities published posters. Wanted, Annanias Mathe, serial rapist and robber. A R150,000 reward was offered. Superintendent Andre Neethling of the Gauteng police led the manhunt, telling the press, "Mathe's ambition is to be the best criminal possible." The bounty and warnings were clear. This was a dangerous fugitive. Meanwhile, Mathe was trying his old tricks. He broke into homes again, just for a day or two, to steal food, weapons, and maybe hostages. Each time, the dogs outside collapsed lifeless. The press dubbed him the Houdini of C-Max. Then, on 4 December 2006, the story took its final turn. A Johannesburg security officer tracked a stolen BMW's GPS signal to a township on the outskirts of the city. He found Mathe inside, holding a family hostage at gunpoint, trying to steal the car outright. In the confrontation that followed, Mathe fired at the officer but missed. The guard returned fire and shot Mathe in the leg. Bleeding and cornered, Mathe finally surrendered. It was over. The Houdini was back in handcuffs, this time in police custody. In a mess of velvet coats and blood on tiled floors, the notorious escape artist was just a man wounded on the ground. A reporter on the scene later wrote that Mathe uttered no final taunt as he was carried away. His game of cat and mouse had ended. Mathe's second recapture brought him straight to trial. In the cold light of courtroom day, the courts unspooled the horrors of his crimes. Victims took the stand. A husband who had risked his life to stop a break-in. A terrified woman who still flinched at the sound of doors. 7 rape survivors, their voices shaking as they recalled that night. But the evidence was stark. Police photographs, victim statements, even DNA. By 3 June 2009, the jury in Gauteng High Court had reached a verdict. Guilty on 64 of 71 charges, including multiple counts of rape, assault, robbery, attempted murder, and burglary. In that moment, Annanias Mathe's reign of terror, at least in the eyes of the court, was over. December 2009. Judge Geraldine Borchers stood to pass sentence. The courtroom was silent. She described Mathe as a hardened, vicious criminal who had shown no remorse. Her words were heavy as she laid out the punishment. 54 years in prison, essentially a life sentence. He would not be eligible for parole until he was 76 years old. Borchers explained that such a sentence was needed given how humiliatingly he had terrorized his victims. No human being can live long enough to serve more, she said, making it clear Mathe's freedom was gone for good. Outside, prosecutors and victims' families heard justice had been done. Yet even as cameras flashed, there was no celebration. The wounds Mathe left were too deep. Survivors wept quietly, holding each other. A grandmother of one victim, arms around her crying daughter, whispered, "Now he will answer for what he did." Mathe went back to prison, far beyond CMAX now, it turned out. By 2016, he was held at Ibongweni CMAX in KwaZulu-Natal. Even behind bars, he was restless. If a nation thought the Houdini Act was done, Mathe was determined to prove them wrong. In 2013, guards found him chipping away at his cell wall. Mathe had hollowed a hole 33 centimeters wide into the concrete, using a secret hammer and chisel. He worked in near silence, sticking to quiet nights. When wardens discovered the hole, Mathe just shrugged. 3 years later, in September 2016, he tried again. This time he sawed through the metal bars of his cell with a stolen hacksaw and smashed the glass of a window. He almost slipped out, but as noise alarmed the guards, they stormed the cell block and caught him in the act. For Annanias Mathe, there would be no third escape. While imprisoned, Mathe was noted to be in poor health. He often complained of stomach pains and vomiting. Prison officials grew concerned but still kept him under tight watch. 23 December 2016. Guards hustled Mathe to a hospital in Durban. Reports say it was King Edward VIII Hospital. He was pale, doubled over. Doctors diagnosed a serious digestive ailment. Whether it was cancer, an ulcer, or something else, was never fully publicized. 4 days later, on 27 December 2016 at around 4:30 p.m., Annanias Mathe quietly died in that hospital bed. The man who had eluded escape for so long succumbed not to an armed standoff or a jailbreak gone wrong, but to sickness. Corrections officials later said he had died of complications from his stomach condition. When the news broke, there were no scenes of jubilation, just stunned disbelief. A flag at the prison was lowered. Mathe's body was laid to rest, reportedly repatriated to Mozambique. His wives and children back home would receive word of his death in a strange silence. The man they helped to free was now truly gone, but all that remained were questions. Annanias Mathe's story is one of extremes, from living legend to quiet death. The nation he terrorized had seen it all: Hollywood-level prison break, ruthless crime spree, and finally, a courtroom reckoning. But many South Africans were left asking, what have we learned? Prison reforms followed Mathe's escape. At least 6 guards at CMAX were dismissed or jailed for corruption. A parliamentary inquiry confirmed that even the most secure prison could be compromised by a few bad actors. It exposed a reality too long ignored, that bribery and corruption were business as usual in some parts of the system. Yet, as Mathe's life ended, the true survivors were those who lived through his crimes. In Parkview, the woman shot at her door still wears scars under her sleeve. In Limpopo villages, families recall waking to masked men in their houses. A mother from one of the rape cases still sleeps with the lights on. For these victims, justice meant a life sentence for Mathe, but their own lives would never fully feel safe again. Ironically, the Houdini needed no publicity in death. Gone was the man who had once declared, "Mathe's life's ambition is to be the best criminal possible," as one officer quoted. Behind bars, quiet as a shadow, Mathe was just another prisoner. At the end of this grim tale, one question hangs in the air. What does it say about society that one man can amass such terror, and that it took a miracle escape to expose our weaknesses? Annanias Mathe made headlines with his bravery and brutality, but his death was unceremonious. For the victims and their families, the horror may have ended, but their recovery is a road without a clear finish line. They face the silent dilemma. Is life finally normal now that Mathe is gone? Or do the nights still echo with fear? We may never know the full answer. In the flickering light of a projector, we conclude the story of the CMAX Houdini. a criminal who seemed unstoppable, now just a cautionary chapter in South Africa's history. His rise and downfall remind us that evil can be cunning, but eventually the law catches up. The screen fades to black, but the question remains: how do we heal from what he unleashed, and will we ever feel truly safe again?